For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shaukat Majumdar from the Ashoka English and Creative Writing Department. And, I want to welcome you to a very special event, the very last event actually for the academic year, because things are winding down now for all of us. And we are in that uncertain spot between whether it's online, offline, things getting better, things getting worse. So I wanted you to bring a session which I think will be of particular interest to our students, as well as to communities beyond it. Particular interest to students because we have obviously at the university literary studies, media studies, and creative writing, all these overlapping disciplines. And today we have with us a wonderful guest who has straddled many of these, spaces. He is a practicing journalist. He has been a practicing journalist for much of his career. I think he was till recently the managing editor of Hindustan Times. But he's also a novelist, also a memoirist, a cricket writer. So clearly, he's somebody who is not bound by theme or genre in any way. Clearly, he's moved between so many different subjects. And I know Shomo that he still has a very keen interest in soccer, even though he writes mostly about cricket. So he is very much into that. And Ramchandra Guha has praised his cricket writings widely among other people. So that's something which he's already known for. He's also written a novel, and he's also written a memoir on similar subjects. I think he's going to talk about that today. And his memoir is very, evocatively titled "Dad's the Vote." And I also know this from my conversation with Shomo that he's very close to his daughter, who is, I believe, now in college in Canada. So I think that's a really interesting. And I have students who are interested in this overlapping genre of memoir and fiction, memoir and journalism. And of course, for our students who are still negotiating the relationship between journalism and creative and writing fiction and writing poetry and the study of literature, I think this is going to be really, really fascinating. I have to say that I met Shomo long before we met physically. Actually, we haven't met physically yet. We've only met on phone.
Metaphysically.
Metaphysically, yes, the weird world of Zoom on the phone. But many years before that, we met in an interesting combination. We were both, two of us, along with two other people, were co-dedicatees to, Amit Chaudhary, a writer I think all of us admire quite a bit. Picador Book of Modern Indian Literature. And I remember when I saw the dedication page, it was written. This was when I was in college myself. Shaukat to Shaukat, Shomo, and Shaukat, Shomo, Shantanu, and Polash. And it's very interesting that all of us went into different directions of writing in academia and other future writers and readers. So that was my first meeting with Shomo, so to say. And of course, we never met, but we got back in touch thanks to the vagaries of social media and because we dwell in the same world. So clearly there's another memoir track right there. So with that in mind, I want to invite Shomo to talk a bit about his writing process, read a bit from his work, and talk about especially, how he goes about his subjects. And I know intriguingly that how one writes a memoir and a novel on the same subject. And then after a point, I'll have some questions. I'm sure some of you will have questions too. So over to you, Shomo, and a very warm and virtual welcome to Ashoka University. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoika. Thank you for your warm, generous, and kind introduction. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to be step back into the audience, but I will be following everything you say very keenly. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Keep a close eye. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. And I'd like to talk this evening about the writing of fiction, memoir, and narrative or creative nonfiction, which is part of journalism, the many forms in which we choose to write, and why a writer chooses one particular form as the vehicle for one particular idea. But first, let us explore in what way and to what extent, in the exercise of writing, the practice of it in any form at all, does the writer's self come into the play? The self that makes the authorial choice in the end of which form to choose. I write fiction, memoir, and narrative or creative nonfiction, including journalism, and I can speak for those genres. How does writing transcend the self while drawing on some of the experiences that particular self has had? How does the self permeate the writing? It's a tricky business. This is a subject that has preoccupied generations of writers. When it comes to the writing of fiction, the great American writer Richard Yates had a terrific line on it. He said, "The impulse of fiction is autobiographical, but the facts never are." Saul Bellow, fellow American great, spoke about fiction being the higher autobiography. The English writer Kingsley Amis called all fiction edited experience. Of course, there's a great deal of irony in what both Bellow and Amis said. Both statements are reductive in the way that writers who get the in-joke understand. Readers who tend to take things literally miss the point. If only writers and writing were that simple. Why does the writing make us seek the writer? Julian Barnes asks in his book, Flaubert's Parrot. But a lot of readers do seek out the writer from the writing. For the sake of those readers, it is important to make this point. Memoir or narrative nonfiction is one thing, although even there is hardly as straightforward as some might imagine. But when it comes to fiction, it gets even more complicated. That is because the writer of fiction is everywhere and nowhere in his own work. "Everything you want to know about me is in my novels," said V.S. Naipaul. This is as true as it is false. Yes and no. Certainly and not at all. In a certain kind of realistic literary fiction, the writer takes the autobiographical impulse and runs with it. What emerges on the page is something that is transmuted by imagination. It transcends the facts. It transcends even the original impulse. The self enters the writing, and the writing emerges from the self. Many readers forget the one link between the two that makes this possible: the leap of the imagination. In The Counterlife, one of his greatest novels, Philip Roth alludes to this. Roth has his narrator and novelist alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman, say, "Life and art are distinct, yet the distinction is wholly elusive. That writing is an act of imagination seems to perplex and infuriate people. Those who seek the writer in his writing would do well to pay attention to this. The writer is everywhere and nowhere in his writing. And it is not just in fiction, in memoir and creative nonfiction too. Because setting down a narrative is always an act of storification. It makes demands on the imagination of the writer. There's one thing that the writer, be it literary fiction, memoir, journalism, narrative nonfiction, undoubtedly relies upon a great deal. And that thing is his memory, his recollection of things, the manner in which he remembers detail that give shape and meaning and significance to his narrative. The Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass, a practitioner in all the genres that I mentioned, wrote in an essay, "When it comes to recollection, the writer is a past master. Since narrative is what he writes, he has been trained in the craft. He knows that recollection is like a cat that needs to be stroked, sometimes in the wrong direction, until it starts to tremble, and then to purr. This is how he uses his own recollections. Recollection is his quarry, his compost heap, his archive. He nurtures it as carefully as if it were a second crop." That quote, I find, is a brilliant exposition of how the self and the self's recollection of things forms one of the pillars of any kind of writing. Of course, remembering is not the same as not forgetting. Like close reading, it is an acquired skill. All writers know how hard it is to actually get the writing done. Talking about writing, which is what I'm doing now, or writing about writing is much, much easier than actually doing the writing. I speak from bitter experience. This is the other way in which the self enters the writing. The self that does the actual stuff, the self that is involved more intimately than anyone else in the process of creation, the self that nags and worries and, on occasion, exults. Writing is a lonely endeavor. Unlike, say, filmmaking or putting out a play, it is not collaborative in any way. There is only the writer and his aloneness and the blinking cursor on the screen. The writer is involved in the creation of a parallel world, a home of his own, to which he returns every time he comes back to his desk. No wonder it is so full of self-doubt, this business. Is what I'm writing good? Is it any good at all? And then he goes back and looks at it, and it seems not much good. And he is filled with self-loathing for what he has produced. Why can't my stuff be any better? Often he hates himself for it. It's a bit like going on and on and on, trying to build a brick wall without knowing whether it will stand in the end. And yet, contrary to the self-doubt and the self-loathing, runs another current, that of self-belief. Writers need that self-belief to persevere, to keep at it, to overcome the doubt, and to stay the course. Without that self-belief, nothing would be possible. Now, how does the self of the writer, who is everywhere and nowhere in the writing, choose the form in which he will tell his story? How does it decide on the form? Should it be fiction, memoir, creative nonfiction? I attach no particular primacy to any of these forms. I believe the material the writer has dictates the authorial choice of the form of the narrative. In this matter, I find Naipaul to be the perfect example. While writing about Naipaul, his fellow Nobel laureate J.M. Coetzee said, "The mode of writing that Naipaul has perfected over the years, in which historical reportage and social analysis flow into and out of autobiographically colored fiction and travel memoir, a mixed mode that may turn out to be his principal legacy to English letters. Naipaul was masterful in bending genres. But how and why did he come to make that decision? Let us hear it from the man himself. What I'll read out now is from the opening essay of Naipaul's collection, Literary Occasions. The essay is titled, with Napoleon clarity and directness, Reading and Writing. Here's Naipaul on how he felt and took stock of his writing life after the publication of his first few novels. My material, my past, separated from me by place as well, was fixed and, like childhood itself, complete. It couldn't be added to. This way of writing consumed it. Within 5 years, I had come to an end. My writing imagination was like a chalk-scrawled blackboard, wiped clean in stages, and at the end, blank again, tabula rasa. Fiction had taken me as far as it could go. There were certain things it couldn't deal with. It couldn't deal with my years in England. There seemed no social depth to the experience. It seemed more a matter for autobiography. Remember, when Naipaul's writing this, the word memoir wasn't really in currency in the critical discourse. And it couldn't deal with my growing knowledge of the wider world. Fiction, by its nature, functioning best within certain fixed social boundaries, seemed to be pushing me back to worlds like the island world or the world of my childhood, smaller than the one I inhabited. Fiction, which had once liberated me and enlightened me, now seemed to be pushing me towards being simpler than I really was. For some years, 3, perhaps 4, I didn't know how to move. I was quite lost. Fiction, the exploration of one's immediate circumstances, had taken me a lot of the way. Travel had taken me further. So, as my world widened beyond the immediate personal circumstances that bred fiction, and as my comprehension widened, the literary forms I practiced flowed together and supported one another. And I couldn't say that one form was higher than another. The form depended on the material. The books were all part of the same process of understanding. It was what the writing career, at first only a child's fantasy, and then a more desperate wish to write stories, had committed me to. That is brilliant, isn't it? In my own writing career, I have been struck by and taken advice from what Naipaul said. The material is everything. It tells a writer which form he should tell his story in. I'll tell you what happened to me and try and explain it from experience. This, however, could be anyone's experience, anyone's conundrum, anyone's solution. It is my story, but it could just as well be yours. Because writing is about the personal and the universal, and it is about the personal transcending the personal and becoming universal. Soon after my first book, You Must Like Cricket, was published in the summer of 2006, the thought of writing about fatherhood had begun to occupy my mind. My daughter was 5 years old at the time. I was fascinated by how a child alters one's relationship with oneself, how she subverts what one had thought of as one's priorities, and how so much of fatherhood was a paradox between delighting in and regretting the passage of a succession of unique, evanescent moments. But the material that I had, while containing my experience as a father and my absorption in the life of a growing child, did not lend itself to memoir. I realized I wanted to write about a man who is obsessed with the notion of being a good father and then fails to be one. He is a man driven by the ambition to become a writer and fails to do so. Forget about books. He fails to have a single article published, even in a newspaper. He is a man orphaned when he was a child, who is determined to be a good husband and watches his marriage end in tatters. He is a man who's so wealthy because of his inheritance that he has never needed to have a day job, whose money multiplies as India's stock market goes up, and then begins to get wiped out as, on the back of a scam, the market starts to crash. I wanted to write a study of spectacular failure, a story of how the economy of an aggressively consumerist country can make and then break on its wheel a man who wanted to be nothing more and nothing less than a writer, a good father, and a decent husband. Fatherhood came into it in a big way because the father-daughter relationship was the prism through which the narrative was seen. But that material needed to be treated as fiction. It turned into my novel, If I Could Tell You. Still, the idea of exploring all those themes about fatherhood, trying to understand what they meant, writing from my point of view rather than that of an imagined narrator's, that idea refused to go away. When I had looked around me as a new father, I couldn't see in India a fatherhood memoir that sought to examine all this new stuff that takes residence at the heart of a father's life. I wanted to write a memoir about being a father. 2.5 years after the publication of If I Could Tell You, my memoir called Dad's the Word, episodic, only loosely chronological, and arranged in vignettes, came out. I won't encumber you, I think, with readings from both books. What I'll do is read you a brief section from If I Could Tell You. There's a lot of postmodern metafictional stuff going on in the novel, in the sense that it's framed as the father, who's the central character, writing a series of letters to his daughter, where he explains how his life has gone wrong. Now, they aren't really letters, because what he says is he types it all up, and towards the end, there's a scene where he prints them all off out and wants to send them to an agent. So essentially what he is doing is he thinks he is having one last go at writing a novel. He's writing a novel in the guise of a confessional. The narrator of the novel, that is. What the author of the novel, that is me, is doing is he is writing a novel in the guise of a confessional. So the narrator writes a confessional in the guise of a novel, and the author writes a novel in the guise of a confessional. Interestingly, the narrator and the author, the daughter of the narrator and the daughter of the author, share a name. And a lot of the things that happen to the narrator are the exact opposite of what happened to the author. So this is how it starts, and I'll read a couple of pages. Oishi, that is what I named you, that drunken, delirious, hope-filled evening, 12 hours after you had been born. I think as you get older, you will get asked this question. I may as well tell you now at the outset. In Bengali, your name means divine. In Japanese, delicious. I always wanted to claim for myself the privilege of having named you. Not that anyone was competing with me for the favor. For the Bengali meaning of your name, I have my Chaluntika, my worn, thick Bengali dictionary to thank. Its cover is red and rough, and my fingers, when I stroke it, scrape against it. It was one of the things my mother had left me. The evening you were born, I went through the dictionary with the purpose of finding a name for you. It was not so much to exclude your mother from the exercise, but to hug to myself, and only to myself, the pleasure of it. So I riffled through the pages and sipped my vodka, twirling the glass every now and then. The silence of the flat amplified the sound of the ice cubes chiming in the glass. It wasn't merely to do with how the word sounded, though. Your name had to be just right. I had my own criteria for it. It had to be short. It had to be, unlike mine, phonetic. It had to be, for a Bengali child, unusual. The meaning had to be appropriate. Oishi in Bengali seemed to me to have all those qualities. It also seemed to embody that particular evening when life seemed more full of possibilities than it had ever done. The other meaning I found out much later when, while wandering in a supermarket aisle in Canberra, I stumbled upon a packet of instant noodles that had been made in Japan. I bought it on that occasion and several times afterwards. That day, as I stood outside the store clutching the Oishi noodles in a brown paper packet, the heat seemed to rise like mists of morning vapor from the pavement. One did not sweat in this sort of climate. It was almost as if the heat dried out the sweat before it could properly form. The double glass doors swung to and fro every time someone went in or out. The draft of the air conditioning emitted every time the doors opened and closed was divine. We, your mother and I, loved the noodles. They were delicious. You never quite acquired the taste for it. You were born at 7:30 in the morning. That evening, I had not yet come to terms with what having you with us actually meant. I had not had to do any of the hard work. Your mother had done all of that. I felt no more grown up or no different from the evening before. I wondered if this was how it was supposed to be. It hardly seemed the life-altering event I had been led to believe it was, or indeed was expecting it to be. It had been, as I've said, only 12 hours. So I drank blackcurrant vodka and keenly consulted my Chaluntika. Absolute concentration. There was nothing for me to do. We had few friends in the new city to which we had moved. We had no family there. Thank you very much for your patience. I'd like to close this talk by emphasizing, and one cannot overemphasize this point, that writing is hard. If you despair, if you doubt yourself as a writer, if you sometimes find it really, really difficult, that is because it is difficult. If you are in it for the long haul, and I hope students in the English and Creative Writing Department at Ashoka University will be in it for the long haul, this is something that you will simply have to live with. And it's not just me saying it. I'll close by leaving you in the hands of the modern greats. William Styron, writing is hell. Martin Amis, writers' lives are all anxiety and ambition. No one begrudges them the anxiety. A.L. Kennedy, it's literature, baby. No one ever said that it would be easy. Norman Mailer, every one of my books had killed me a little more. And finally, Ernest Hemingway, there's nothing to writing. All you do is sit at the typewriter and bleed. Remember what they said. Don't give up the fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoma. And that's, I particularly that last caveat, I think is very important for people who are starting out at this point. And so much blood goes into writing. I think we know that. And but I also want to thank you for that lovely reading from that novel.
Thank you.
It's beautiful. It's so moving, so deeply moving. And I could just see that evening that I could touch the Cholantika, I could taste that blackcurrant vodka, and I could feel the quest for the name. So that was really beautifully done. And one cannot help but think, what must a daughter feel, fictional or real, when they read something like that, the act of your naming, so that was very evocative, and you read beautifully. So that was
Thank you. Thank you. Very kind of you.
I wanted to. There's so many things I want to. So I can ask. I mean, I was. But maybe I'll start with my Paul, because you actually have chosen an essay or a chapter of that book which I happen to teach this semester in my World English class. The same chapter, reading and writing. The opening chapter of that
Literary occasions.
Literary occasion. So and it's a lovely chapter. I've written about it actually in a recent occasion as well. And there's so many things even there. I found it very striking when Paul was talking about his time in England, and he felt it lacked social depth. That life in England lacked social depth, and obviously touched me personally very much, because I've spent many years in the US, and all the time I was writing novels, I was writing about India. So I think I kind of know, even though separated by almost 100 years, I know what it means. And obviously, as you know, it's only after I moved back that I've written about the US. So it's something about the absent world which energizes you. But I was very taken, I was very intrigued by something Paul says there, that, my life in England lacked social depth, and therefore wasn't suited for fiction. It seemed more the material for autobiography. It's almost like he's saying that, oh, you need a certain kind of social depth for fiction, which you don't need for autobiography. What do you think of that? I mean, in what sense can autobiography do without the kind of social depth that fiction requires to become worlded? I mean, I don't know if
No,
you understand.
yeah, well, as I said, at the time that Naipaul was writing, autobiography was the term prevalent in the critical cultural discourse.
Mhm.
So the term memoir had not yet been born. And autobiography tended largely at the time to be a sort of bold recording of facts, a kind of linear, chronological narration of the life of a writer. There were exceptions, of course. Neeraj C. Chaudhary's autobiography of an unknown Indian, but of course, that isn't autobiography. That really is memoir. because the term memoir probably wasn't so prevalent, it goes by the name of autobiography. If you look at the contemporary scene, you'd have an autobiography by, say, Wayne Rooney or Katie Price, whereas Martin Amis or Blake Morrison would be writing memoirs. So I think when Naipaul talks about autobiography, he talks about that sort of autobiography. If it were to be memoir in the true sense, obviously it would need social depth. And if you look at Naipaul's own writing, whether travel memoirs or his memoir, though he doesn't call them memoirs, of course, memoirs about his life in Trinidad and his father, they have enormous social depth, of course.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I mean, I wasn't thinking of the distinction between the two. But of course, as you say, that is a historical phenomenon. It also sounds like autobiography has a kind of a burden of comprehensiveness, that it has to be comprehensive. Just the way a biography has those things like standard or authorized biography, whereas a memoir can be episodic or fragmented. Memoir can be, more part. So
It
that's
can be free flowing, it can be selective in how it chooses to remember the facts of one's life. So, I mean, it's a very free flowing, up to the author to decide what he wants to hold back, what he wants to say. It is unencumbered by having to offer a bold, all views considered account of one's life. It's supposed to be more interesting than that,
right.
and intensely literary.
And yet it's interesting why fiction has that burden of social depth. I feel even I'm thinking in some ways, if I have to turn something of my life into fiction vis-a-vis writing about it, memoir, I think we are sort of liberated when we record it as a memoir, because we kind of can claim that the world really exists, because it really does. Whereas when you're talking about fiction, I think the requirement for a certain kind of world making becomes important, because you can't claim the world exists in the way you claim when it is a memoir. So in a way, you kind of have to provide density and texture to the world, even if it's a real world. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud
No,
that.
I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. And I'd just add that while it is liberating to do the memoir because you don't have to make the world and you can say that, yes, it does exist. In fiction, it is liberating because you can do whatever you want to. It is liberating in a different sense because the world making liberates you. Whereas in memoir, you are actually tied down to the world that exists. So,
Right.
yeah, so I mean, it cuts both ways, but I agree with you completely.
Right. And of course, as we know, the narration of something is not just about the substance, but also the very act of narration. I mean, there was one term that came up recently in my creative writing class was something about wood and carving. I mean, to use a
Sorry,
kind
say
of
that again. Sorry.
wood and carving, wood and
Right, right,
carving,
right.
two terms. I mean, to use a more cliched understanding, if life is wood, fiction is like the carving. How do you carve it? What do you leave out? And of course, as you notice, carving means more deleting. So you
Yeah.
delete material than I don't add anything, but of course you delete. So selection is what is important, what you select to narrate. And it's very interesting that, we can change the order. Like I think even in a memoir, you don't have to start at the beginning. Just the way with fiction, you may not be able to take the kind of liberties of a postmodern narrator, though you can certainly make movements in that direction where you are kind of released from the obligation of telling events in the order in which they happened, right? So in that sense, you are, who was it who said that forgetting, all fiction is memoir, all memoir is a lie, or something like that. So this whole idea that when you're writing a fiction, it's always autobiographical. And when you're writing an autobiography, you're actually not being truthful because you know that you're
Yeah.
now being accountable. Whereas in fiction, that liberty. So yeah, I think this is fascinating because these are subjects which I think concern many of us. We've dealt with this in many different forms. I think, but I wanted to sort of bring up a subject which I think a lot of our students grapple with, the subject with which you started, that is the self. And self is, of course, the axis around which both fiction, memoir, and autobiography, to distinguish it, revolve. And what I've noticed a lot is that for most writers, the self remains a very thorny subject throughout, but particularly for younger writers who are starting out, um, who, and something I often say that, fiction, if you're writing fiction or poetry for that matter, or any form of imaginative writing, just for yourself, then you are writing a journal. Your writing is therapeutic. But if you really want it to mean something to the reader, you have to make it effective. It's not about what you feel, but making the reader feel in a certain way. And I think what we notice most, certainly in college, is that a lot of writers come with a lot of therapeutic intent, that they write expressing, venting a feeling, whether it's falling in love, having a fight with one's family, or whatever, or anxieties about growing up. I mean, all the real things that happen, and they make for great art. But they are themselves. The self is at the center of this imaginative universe. And of course, as we know, fiction involves not just the self, but also becoming other people. And also the self sometimes becomes an invented form. On the other hand, they're facing the rules of academic writing, which the way it stands now is all about effacing the self. That you become a scholar by effacing your voice, you kind
That's
of
right.
show a certain kind of dedication to the archive, which I think is partly elusive, because if you're really going to be a scholar of the arts, you can never really efface yourself. But there's a certain kind of a gesture that, things like don't write in the first person, talk about, whatever. Um, and I think they get really torn between the two. In a way, the bigger goal is to win them away from the self because they're so full of it. But sometimes when they are kind of ending their undergraduate career, third or fourth year, they've lost the self so much that they've kind of picked on this really artificial voice which takes the life out of even critical writing. So I mean, it took me forever to figure these things out, the conventions of grad school, this, and I was writing fiction at the same time I was writing criticism, but they were far apart. It's only much later that I was able to assume a fictional voice while writing criticism, that one can be anecdotal, one can be narrative, and criticism is also like an unfolding of a certain narrative which unfolds through time. Your thesis is a kind of an organic thing. It doesn't remain the same. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the self, and what are some meaningful ways in which a young writer, say 18, 19, is starting out, might deal with the self?
No, it's a fascinating question, and it's a fascinating subject, of course.
Mhm.
And I did talk about right at the outset about the self of the writer, which makes authorial choices, and the self of the writer that is everywhere and nowhere in his work. I mean, whichever genre he may be writing in. And I think that is related in a way to the effacement of the self, that the writer is nowhere in his work and yet is everywhere in his work. Because even if effaced, the very fact that it is that self that creates is something that cannot be denied. Now, how much of that self that creates wants to put in of himself or herself in the narrative is again an authorial choice. I mean, writing, as we all know, is so much about decision making. What decisions you make, whether it is in terms of plot, whether it is in terms of character, whether it is in terms of narrative, whether it is in terms of form, language. I mean, it's just decisions, decisions, decisions. So I think how much of that self the writer wants to place center of stage, to what extent, is his choice. If you look at the new journalism, of the late 60s and 70s, which started in America, I mean, which later became Gonzo stuff and Hunter Thompson and Truman Capote and what used to be called the non-fiction novel. Joan Didion, to a great extent, in her best work. That is all to do with placing the self at the center of the narrative. And this was all creative nonfiction, as you know. So even in fiction, whether you place the self at the center or off stage is finally a choice that the writer makes. I mean, for the new journalism, writing in third person became obsolete. I mean, people were writing only in the first person, which also gave rise to a lot of really crap writing later on, because not everyone is Joan Didion and not everyone can carry it off. But it had suddenly become the rage to do first person narrative nonfiction writing.
Right. I mean, yeah, there are those historical moments, of course, that has moved. I mean, I'm thinking, of course, also Wayne Booth's Rhetoric of Fiction, where he talks about there are multiple selves. There's not just one self. There's the biographical author, there's the implied author, there's the narrator. So there are three layers right away.
Yeah.
And you have a narrator even when you have an omniscient third-person narrator, invisible. In fiction or even memoirs can use a certain narrator. So yeah, I mean, I guess there are so many ways of mediating, and yet I mean, when you say the author is nowhere and everywhere, I think the first thought for me is like Stephen Dedler speaking God as picking his polishing his fingernails, just it's like
Joyce.
Sort of that Joyce.
Paring his fingernails.
Paring his fingernails, right, sorry, thank you. Paring his fingernails, like the whole idea that I'm completely detached, and I'm not really involved in the voice. So if it's Daedelus's voice, the novel has a very different texture. When it's Leopold Bloom's voice, it has a completely different texture. And it changes. And even within Daedalus, Portrait of an Artist, starts with a baby's voice, and then it kind of ends with a mature voice trying to rewrite, Aristotle's Poetics. So there's no fixed form. And yet there are other writers like, say, Lawrence, who is completely different. Lawrence has a kind of a defining voice, which is there in all his novels. Joyce kind of hands over his voice to the character at the moment. Lawrence's voice is always there. I think Woolf is also more like Lawrence than like Joyce.
Yeah.
So there are these fascinating ways in which voice can be, modulated. And I think this whole relationship between the self and the other is a very dialectical one. You can never define when self ends and the other begins. And there are traces of otherness in yourself. There's traces of the self in the other. And this, I mean, I found this myself in trying to create characters who are extremely different from me and characters who are similar to me. So even while creating characters so different, you realize there are elements of yourself even in those characters. And
in every character, as a matter of fact.
Creating characters similar, you realize, okay, I'm not always like that. So, it's, I think one of the most rewarding things about writing fiction is realizing this continuity between the self and the other. And therefore, and that is something I think, it's kind of a discovery, right? I mean, don't you think you can't really tell anybody this process, right?
No, it's very hard to describe. And I think it's only if one has done it oneself, one knows what you're saying. So, I mean, I know perfectly well what you're saying, but it's very hard to explain to a non-practicing writer the almost magical nature of how one elides into the other, how one is withheld from the other, and how there are degrees of commonality between characters who are not at all, apparently not at all like the author himself. So I think that is part of the whole alchemy of fiction writing.
Right, that's really interesting. I think we are getting close to the hour assigned to us. But before we end, I was just wondering if you'd say a little bit about your the fascination of yourself with sports. I think that's a subject which is great interest to many people who are and will be listening to this in the future. Do you want to say a bit about what made you write about cricket and why you don't want to miss any match? And I know you're headed to one right after this. So do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, actually, it's a discussion for another day. But I was interested in sport as a small boy. I was fascinated by it, and I used to play a lot of it. As I grew older, the playing stopped by and large. But I treat watching sport like a spectator sport. So I don't play much sport, but you should watch me watch it. Now, when I wrote my first book, You Must Like Cricket, which was actually not so much about as around cricket, and I wanted to explore the somewhat troubling hold that one sport had over 1 billion people. So it was more a book about how cricket, though it was framed as a memoir and it was written in the first person, it was a book that tried to explore how cricket defined and unified a country as diverse as India. So it was a book about cricket and India. I'm actually interested in three kinds of sport. I mean, cricket, tennis, and football. These are the three that I follow really, really closely and have written about, not in book form, cricket only in book form, but I've written about extensively in my career as a journalist and an essayist about the other two as well. I think the great thing is sport is that it is so vitally important and so completely unimportant to one's lives. I mean, it doesn't have any bearing on my life as a person. And yet, for the hours that I'm immersed in it, it seems to be the be all and the end all of everything. So, in a way, it is an escape. In a way, it is an immersion. In a way, it tells you that it's not important at all, and yet makes you feel, believe truly that it is at that moment the most important thing in the universe. So there's that wonderful dichotomy to it that I find fascinating.
That is indeed fascinating, and I love the way you put it. I mean, that it's completely unimportant but all important at the same time. I mean, there's almost something aesthetic about it. That the definition of the aesthetic is that it adds beauty, which is not instrumental, utilitarian, and I think sports does that. And I was thinking of some of Roland Barthes' writing on sports, wrestling, and he writes about drinks and I think steak and all these things about the cultural elements. Um, but I wonder, what is the definition of important and unimportant? Because sports does offer a great means to social bonding, right? It's a big cement for social life. I also grew up kind of quite fanatical about cricket, and then once I, went to the US, I kind of lost touch with it because suddenly it's not a big sport there. And I never really got into American sports, football, American football, and which is I still have the habit of calling football soccer. It's the American habit of calling it soccer. But I think it does offer a great social bonding, and I
Of course, it does.
realized that the reason I lost touch with cricket and I never regained it even after I came back is because there was no community around me who was watching cricket anymore, which is why I grew up my father watching cricket and all that. Um, but it was just gone after. So in a way, it does have a social function, right? There's a big social function.
It is. I mean, it's a great community builder, and fandom or support for a particular team, be it a club or a county or a country. I mean, it is a way that brings people together like nothing else really can. I mean, which was what I was trying to explore in that first book of mine of how cricket as a sport unites Indians who would otherwise have had nothing to do with each other. You know, the guy with his nose pressed against electronics shop window on a thoroughfare in a big city, watching the TV inside, which is on display, and in a huddle with all those other people. And a guy who's, say, in the bar in Taj Kulaba in Bombay having Dom Perignon and watching on TV the same game. and they're united in that moment because it's that same game that brings them together. So nothing really would be able to do that. Nothing else really would be able to do that.
Yes.
Not even Hindi films, which is the other big unifier, because these two people are not watching that same film at the same moment. Here you have these two people from two different worlds who are absorbed in the same activity at the same moment. And they're brought together by that. And it's the only thing that would sort of ever be able to bring them, that they would ever probably have in common.
That social class difference. Yeah. It's the ultimate imagined community, as Benedict Anderson said about newspapers, in the 19th century, which people brought together. But of course, now it's sports and electronic media. So thanks so much, Omar. This is really, really wonderful. I really want to urge, my students and others in the audience to sort of explore more of Omar's writing, because I think this range alone is so fascinating. Someone who can get into sports in the spirit that it does, looking at its aesthetic element, its social element, its supreme uselessness, and its supreme importance that it can exist at the same space. It's really fascinating. And from there to talk about fatherhood, both in fictional and memoir form, as well as, regularly he's writing as we speak every other day, articles in his papers, Economic Times, Hindustan Times, I think several publications abroad. So you clearly continue to produce so much. So I think it's wonderful that you do it. And there are some common threads I see that keep coming back in whatever I've read of your work. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I know this will be really useful for not just for the regular members of the audience, but many of our students who are grappling between these questions of memoir, fiction, journalism, and trying to find their way through it. So, so it's a delight to hear from you, and hope we'll continue this conversation on other platforms later on.
Thank you, Sharikot. Thank you very much. It was lovely to be here, and thanks a lot for having me. I enjoyed myself, and I hope we'll do it again.
Thank you very much, and a very good evening to all of you. Signing off here. Bye-bye.